Hi, I'm Bronwyn Williams. We're back with the small print, and today my guest is Johan Fourie. Now, Johan, on this show, we ask our guests to introduce themselves. So would you mind introducing yourself in a few words? Tell us who you are, what you do, and what you're really interested in.
Thanks, Bronwyn. It's great to be here. I am a professor of economics at Stellenbosch University. I also I'm a chair in economics, history, and policy. So I think a lot about how to make economic history, lessons from the past, relevant for policymakers, and trying to think of ways to communicate these lessons or these historical examples to policymakers and to the general public through various means and mechanisms, including a blog, which I run, ourlongwalk.com, where I publish columns and essays on, again, the same topic, history lessons, and how they might be relevant for us today.
Quite prolifically too. I mean, you put out content more than a couple of times a week, right?
Yeah, I try to do Mondays and Fridays. I enjoy writing, and so it's more like a hobby, but it's nice if your hobby can pay as well.
Yeah, that's always nice. Well, we got you on the show because we like to talk about anything to do with politics, economics, history, anything to do that has relevance to the South African electorate. And I think at the moment, the electorate is perhaps slightly more interested in the things that are important to them than they are usually. But I also wanted to ask you about the sort of role that you've chosen in the academic sphere that you specialize in that you specialize in economic history. And both economics and history in our age of relativism and humanities are both very unpopular topics. Would you agree with that statement? Do you think that perhaps both those fields, both the fields of looking at the past and the fields of looking at the current choices that we're making from an economic perspective, perhaps get slightly a bad rap?
I mean, there are reasons why it's become unpopular, and some of them are good, I think valid reasons, and perhaps it's useful to acknowledge those reasons. So certainly on the economic side, I think it's become over the last 2-3 decades more mathematical, and so it's left a large cohort, certainly in South Africa, of students that might have been interested in this topic, left them basically unable to participate in some of these debates and unable to read even the literature. I mean, certainly for some of us that were trained in the early 2000s, the literature has become certainly far more technical, and it's difficult to kind of engage often with topics that you feel should be relevant, but are very difficult to access, these international publications and journals. So there's, I think, merit in that, economics has become a bit distant. If you think about people with challenges every day, facing real challenges, for them, this seems very, very far, these, mathematical models about human behavior. So on that side, certainly, I think there's merit. Certainly also on the history side, I think there's merit in that history used to be, all about the big questions of the past and these big shifts, whereas I think increasingly it's become, it's adopted the kind of postmodern ideas of, it's esoteric, everything is relative, and so it's basically shied away from asking these big questions that I think a lot of students are interested in, and so if you've just studied very mathematical economics and you've sat in 1 or 2 history classes where perhaps the focus has not been on the kind of things that interest you, it makes sense that this has been a bit frustrating. And hopefully, I think in economic history, we can find a midway that we can actually use some of the kind of more practical, empirical, actually, tools of economics and combine that with some of the big questions of history to actually get at something that students would find interesting.
Well, that definitely resonates with me because I'm definitely a big picture rather than a small detail kind of person in general. And I do like big history. And the parts of economics that are interesting are both the really macro, big story parts and the really small anecdotal parts. But I also wanted to go a little bit further into that question with you, and that you have written about how history perhaps needs to pay a little bit more attention to economics. But at the same time, you haven't exactly said it, but perhaps there's a sort of implication there that perhaps economists also need to take a bit of a look at history rather than just looking at the present data.
Yeah, I published actually 2 weeks in a row. The first one was on why economists need to pay more attention to history, and that was very specifically about a paper that was published in a top economics journal by 3 Brazilian scholars, where they wrote about South Africa's 1980s, the forced removals, and almost cited no South African historians. So of course there have been lots of history that's been written about this, and they just took basically data sets that are already problematic. The censuses of the 1980s exclude many South Africans, and they just took that almost unproblematically and just adopted their methods to those data sets and published the results. And of course, these were interesting methods, econometric methods, but I just thought that the policy implications of those results were, well, problematic is probably the best way to say that. I think there were large gaps that they missed in the interpretation of both the data, so kind of contextualizing, problematizing the data, critiquing the data, kind of exposing its weaknesses, and then the kind of trying to make kind of global statements. I think that one of the interesting things that they did, for example, was to now they've studied forced removals in South Africa, and they try to apply this to housing policy in Chicago, right? These are completely different contexts, and so it becomes like an ahistorical study that I don't think has actually been would contribute anything meaningful to economics, even though this was published in the top paper. So that paper generated quite a lot of interest. Interestingly, I had a lot of responses from economists saying thank you, and I should actually add, this is not just my opinion. This was in some sense co-authored by many economists and historians, because I asked at least 10 of my colleagues in economics and history for their comments on the paper, and so in some sense it's like this puzzle that I built from their feedback. And then the following week, I wrote about how historians, I think, actually should also integrate economics into their teaching. And I just looked at the curricula of history courses at South African universities, and basically showed that there's nothing of the Industrial Revolution. There's nothing about progress that's been made over the last 2 or 3 centuries. It's all about exploitation. And I just thought that that's just a very, very warped view of the past. Of course, we can acknowledge terrible things that have happened, but of course, we should also acknowledge the great things that have happened, so that we can continue on that progress, this path of progress, and of course, try and avoid as much of the bad things as possible.
Yeah, but of course, then you do need to do some sort of measurements in order to have any sort of idea of progress. You need to be comparing apples with apples, oranges with oranges, which does bring us back to maths. Not very complicated algorithmic maths, like a lot of the current, as you say, sort of economics grad school coursework is related to. But you do need some sort of, coming back to our original conversation, some sort of basis of common truth upon which to build your assumptions, right? So you need to be measuring something. You have to make sure that something is consistent over time, and you have to make sure that what you're measuring actually matters. Now, on this show, we have had some conversations about some of the problems and some of the numbers that we use to measure progress or growth or flourishing or whatever that might be. But from your perspective, what are some of the things that we can track across space and time in order to make actual reasonable, reasoned decisions about what works and what doesn't? Because that's really the point of economics, whether we're coming at it from a theoretical basis or a practical basis. Hopefully, we're wanting to use that information either to track what works or to make suggestions about how things can work better. And for that, we do need to rely on some sort of data.
No, I think that's a great question. I mean, almost to start off by saying, it's not really math that these students need, it's statistics, right? It's the fact that they should be able to understand what the kind of sample is, what the population is, basic concepts like the average and the median. These things are different, and yet that's often lacking in at least my encounter with many undergrad students. So yeah, that's a great question about what we should measure. I mean, something that economic historians obviously think a lot about, because we often are forced to think creatively about ways of measuring things, given that we can't just survey people 200 years ago. So we need to think about what was left behind and how can we use whatever is left behind in a creative way to get some measurement of progress or not over time. So of course, I'm GDP per capita is a much maligned indicator, but I still think it's an incredibly useful one. It's of course that's only been developed about a century ago. So we don't have historical GDP estimates, we have to reconstruct them from what we have available. So there are, assumptions that we make, but I think that there's a big enough cohort of very smart economic historians who've tried their best to come up with, I think, as reliable estimates as possible. And you can go back, 1,000 years now and measure these things. It was started with the Angus Madison project, and that's ongoing. Every couple of years, they publish an updated version of that. And that gives you a pretty good sense of what the average income was of countries, people in countries going back a couple of hundred years. And it's great to kind of compare South Africa also there to some of our neighbors now, but also some of the countries that we tend to compare ourselves with. But there are other ways. The way I would typically start a lecture, or if I have to give a talk, invite a talk, I would show the GDP per capita. But for many people, I find that that's beautiful, nice hockey stick graph, but it feels quite a bit removed because we can't really get a sense of what exactly GDP per capita. If I tell you $3,000 in 2010 prices, you don't really have a sense of what that means. But if I tell you that 1 in 4 kids died before the age of 5, you have a very good sense of what that means, right? So I think infant mortality to me is a great way, and because we have historical death records typically going back at least 100 or 200 years even, we can get a very good sense of what the living standard was over time, looking at how many children died. So for most of our history before the year 1900, 1 in 2 kids basically died before the age of 5, which is, incredible. It's just a profound statement. If people ask me today, like, what is the one thing that's improved over the last 200 years, you can just look at infant mortality. And so that's one measure, I think, that really hammers home the progress we've made. I mean, it would be very, very, and this is the frustrating thing about historians typically is, like, I've recently listened to a podcast where a very prominent historian said that, we've almost made no progress in the last 100 years. And I couldn't believe it. Like, you could just show one figure of infant mortality and you would say, like, this is clearly a sign of immense, so, to put a number on it, 1 in 2 kids died 200 years ago, 1 in 4 kids 100 years ago. Today in South Africa, 1 in 20 kids die before the age of 50, and in Japan, it's 1 in 200, right? So that's clear progress, and obviously for a variety of reasons. So I think that's infant mortality, and you can then think about other longevity. You can think of typical things like wages. One thing economic historians typically use is heights of individuals over time. So there are various ways of doing this.
Yeah, why is it you think that it has become so unpopular to not just uphold, but even to admit to progress?
Well, I think it's fashionable. I think it's you want to get heard. You want to look like a rebel in some sense. And if you can't compete with the economists and adopt their methods, you have to do something that's kind of counter to that. So you have to dismiss numbers and what they say, and there's nothing wrong with critiquing numbers. Of course, they should be open to critique, but to just dismiss them is that's a terrible way of doing science. But I think it's a kind of fashionable within a certain fields, and this is mostly in the humanities. Of course, students see through that, I think, and then you can just look at what happens in terms of PhD graduates in the humanities. In history, for example, PhD numbers have halved in America in the last 2 decades. I mean, that's a profound change in the number of students that's graduating in history degrees, and similar is true for other fields in the humanities. So I think there's a bit of a crisis within the humanities in trying to find a niche, right? That somehow elevates them above, what they surely consider to be, the numerical sciences. And so postmodernism have contributed to that. But I think ultimately it's how do you get recognition in science is to say something that is a bit outlandish and that you can support in however means you can, and that's exactly what's happening here.
Yes, it's a continuous sort of conversation around the mismatch between reality and our perceptions of it. I'm not sure if you've come across the term vibe session. I mean, there's been a few quite high-profile articles written about it, and we've just interviewed the young woman, the young female and popular economist who puts out a lot of content on social media, Kyla Scanlon, on the show. She's got a new book coming out soon now, In This Economy. She's great to talk to, but she coined the expression to look at the mismatch between data and perception in the American economy, whereby individuals, when you ask them how their financial situation's going, most of them say, oh, pretty good, actually. I had quite a good year. And if you look at macro data, the same thing plays out, that the recession wasn't as deep as it was, if there even was a recession in the US, that all the figures that people were afraid of turning in the last couple of years post-COVID have actually held their ground quite well. But if you ask those same individuals how they feel about the overall American economy, they're very pessimistic, right? So there's this disconnect that she terms it the vibe session, the difference between the perceived economy and the actual economy and how we see it. And in America, that's kind of at a deficit at the moment, which is why she coined that session term, saying that people feel more pessimistic about the economy than they're actually experiencing it at the moment in objective terms. Whereas in South Africa, we have like the opposite going on. Heavy Chef Foundation, I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. They've got this the big research that they do continually with South African businesses, small businesses mainly, and entrepreneurs. And they run surveys quarterly. And their latest survey, they were busy asking entrepreneurs that they wrote and published about on Friday last week about how they feel about the South African economy. And almost all the entrepreneurs they interviewed are quite optimistic and quite hopeful, although by all objective measures, our economy is not looking that hot right now. So what is it, do you think, that we have these differences, this sort of excess of optimism in South Africa and this excess of pessimism in America? And we could just compare those two markets because they do really sit at opposite ends of the economic spectrum these days.
That's a great question, Bronwyn. I have no real idea. I mean, I just had a conversation with one of my colleagues here where I said, like, I sense that there is immense optimism. I haven't sensed that in a long time, and yet, the numbers don't look great. So, the job of an economic historian typically is when there is a lot of pessimism to say, well, hold on, here's one or two green shoots to, we shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Maybe we should think about the potential long-term positives that we can, but the opposite is also true, right? When there's maybe over optimism, we should also say we should perhaps be a bit more cautious. Things are not yet. It's not like we're already shooting for the moon yet. And I get a sense that maybe it's just the pre-election optimism. Maybe it's his response was, of course, it is to do with load shedding and the fact that we haven't had load shedding for a long time now. I say long time, a couple of months. But so maybe there's just that very short term. But I do sense that there is, and the way I would think about it, perhaps is that I think there's optimism because there's, for the first time in a very long time, maybe even the first time in 3 decades. There's the sense that there's an expansion of what I would call the opportunity policy set. So, or the policy opportunity set is probably the better way of saying it. So, we've had a certain set of policies for, going back 3 decades, for 7 elections, basically, or 6 elections. And there was very little chance of that shifting. So you maybe had a little bit of a weight difference, so more BE or less BE, but there was BE, right? Or more, emphasis on the NHI or less emphasis, whatever. But there was always the kind of policy set. And now suddenly with the potential of a coalition, you see that set expanding. Like, of course it could expand for the worse if the alliance becomes more populist, but it could also expand to the better. And I think that's what's creating my sense is that the markets at least expect more of a kind of a positive outcome. So the idea that some of these alliance partners might push towards getting rid of some of these policies, or at least push in other directions than what the ANC has had for the last 30 years. I think that really creates some excitement. And whether that will happen, of course, we should be cautious. I guess that's where the message comes from the long run. South Africa is a very we don't have large amplitudes in our economy. I don't know what the best way of saying that is. Like, we have a very stable, in some sense, growth, right? So we don't fluctuate the 1 year 6% like Brazil, and then the next year -2 and then 4 again. And so So in some sense, that's good for, planning going forward. But if things do go well, then it's not as if we're going to quickly shift from 1 to 5 to 7%. Hopefully, we'll get to 2 or 3% soon. But we just don't know.
But that's an interesting thing that you said just now, in that it's almost quite a contrarian take, that you're saying that our optimism actually comes from uncertainty rather than from certainty, which is the usual assumption that investor confidence and like their propensity to save comes from having confidence. Yeah. But if you're having confidence in certainty that's not sort of an ideal world, that's actually less optimistic than having uncertainty when you live in an imperfect world. And that almost contrasts with, say, the American equation, where they have uncertainty, but based on a kind of perfect world at the moment. But there's almost the sense that cannot hold. I don't know if you agree with that, but there's also, I'd love to get your take on the sort of the history side of it. So almost our optimism is coming not from our present situation, optimism here, or pessimism, if again we want to look at the American case just for a nice compare and contrast. It's almost coming from looking back at the present from the future, which is almost a case of like the opposite of history, right? Which history gives us context in our past, but it's almost like we're contextualizing our future from a sense that the present sensor cannot hold, and the sensor not holding in our case might be a good thing, because it leaves room for wiggle, it leaves room for change, it leaves room for improvement. But a center where you kind of are eating more than your share of the pie and not holding leaves a very different future history that you kind of expect to step into. I don't know if you have any comments on that. That's sort of our sense of positioning from a future history perspective.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would add to all of this, I'm not sure if I can confirm or deny what you said. I mean, I think it's an interesting point to think about how we would think about 10 years from now going back. But the one thing I would add is maybe to think about this optimism is that we have increasingly a very different demography in South Africa compared to, say, America and certainly Europe, right? So, young people are generally more positive, right? So that's partly the nice thing about being at a university is like, I get more grumpy as I grow older, but the students are always kind of, more optimistic, even though sometimes they are also pretty pessimistic about, certainly a couple of years ago, they were about South Africa's future. They are more hopeful, I think, about what could be achieved. And so in some sense, our economy is like that, right? We still have a very young population, maybe not as young as other African countries, but certainly still relatively young compared to, say, society in Europe, where, people are on average pretty old. And so they are going to be grumpy and worried about and more pessimistic. I think if you walk around, certainly in Europe, there is a sense of dread, right? Even it could be a beautiful medieval town or city, but it is that there's a clear collective sense of worry about the future. America, I think, is incredibly diverse, and so it's it depends on where you are in America of what you think about the future, right? I think in the South, for example, now. A lot of venture capital, all of these kind of things happening there. I think there's a lot more optimism potentially than perhaps in what you would find in kind of more of the northern parts. Maybe California is different to the Midwest. So, I don't know exactly what, how to think about America as a kind of collective. I just think it's a lot of like interesting. Of course, in that sense, you're right that the coming elections raise this question about going down a path that we don't know in both directions, right? So whether it's Joe Biden or Trump or maybe even a third direction, it's not entirely clear that what is there at the moment can be sustained. But it is an interesting question about like if things go well, are we perhaps overly pessimistic? If things go badly, are we perhaps overly optimistic? And perhaps that's very, very to the essence of the human experience, right? That's you can probably reflect on that in your own life as well. Like when things do go badly, you have to hold on to some kind of hope, and when things go very well, it's sometimes you dread losing what you've got. So maybe that's just being part of being kind of human.
Yes, and then again, from wearing both your hats, both in terms of being an economist and being a historian, I'm sure you're well aware of the importance of the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, and how those stories, however we decide to frame or shape them, directly affect our expectations, which again directly affect the choices that we take. I mean, like, this is what, like, you know, central bankers do all the time, change our expectations about things, and hope that we change our behavior and change the course of history too. I am quite interested in your thoughts around the sorts of stories that you see emerging when you sort of step back from a big history perspective, that you see right now that could have an influence on our collective future, and how perhaps, if you can go that far, these stories are changing now compared to the stories of, say, the last century.
Yeah, I think that's a fascinating area for research. I think economists are late in arriving at, I think most social scientists or humanities scholars would have known that stories matter, right? The way we speak. And of course, there were economists, perhaps on the periphery, economic historians, who had said all along that, you know, of course, the way we talk about things really matter. Deirdre McCloskey is a famous example of, she uses the way we speak about the Industrial Revolution, or at the time of the Industrial Revolution, the way we speak about entrepreneurship really mattered in kind of giving economic entrepreneurs a status, or scientists and innovators a status. It wasn't just the kind of financial returns that they, you know, had to inventing the spinning jenny, but it was really the status that they got from it, and talking to each other, and, you know, in coffee shops and these kind of things. A sense of that you get from, you know, venture capital at the moment, where if you sit in a town like Stellenbosch, there's a lot of excitement about new ideas and innovations and what it could do. And of course, there are potential returns, but there's also the status around, like, I've invested in this company and it's, you know, it's doing quite well. And it's not just the financial or monetary rewards that I think is why people do it. And it's of course that kind of excitement that pulls people in, right? And it kind of, so it's, you know, if you think about selecting into certain kinds of industries, if you're in Stellenbosch, it's very unlikely that you're a smart student, it's very unlikely that you're going to end up in government, right? Because it's just not an attractive place. It's not how you build status. But if you're you know, a smart student and you've got a new idea, then building a new startup seems like a very attractive prospect. And of course, that's going to be far more likely to benefit the economy and society as a whole than potentially ending up in government. So I do think the way we talk, the way we use language or stories to inspire, to incentivize to some extent people to opt into, to self-select into certain industries really matter, or education, even certain disciplines. And I think economists are quite late at, I mean, the economist Robert Schuller has recently written a book, Economic Narratives. So there is some push in that direction, but I think there's much more that needs to be done. I've, for example, over the last couple of months, looked at some of the speeches that our politicians made over the last 15 years or so, just as a very elementary introduction into this field. And to me, what was fascinating is like the things that our politicians focus on, right? So I compared, for example, the political speech. Within the political speeches, I compared how often politicians appeared compared to scientists. And, you know, it's a factor of 10 more basically than scientists. And our most cited scientist is, no surprise, Karl Marx. So, you know, this is, but this matters, I think, right? The way maybe it reflects our interests. So it's maybe not a causal factor. It's maybe just an expression of what we're interested in. But I think that's a very useful indication. And I'm sure if I was to do this with the US, you would find a lot more scientists, innovators, entrepreneurs mentioned in political speeches than, you know, other politicians, for example. So this is something that I'm keen to investigate further. And I'm, you know, it's difficult to think about in economics. You know, we get published based on whether we can make causal analysis. I'm not sure we're going to be able to do that, but I do think we have to think more systematically about how we speak, both as leaders in our society, but also basically just as a general public and the kind of stakeholders in government.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got to consider the words we speak, because especially when we're coming from positions of power, or if you have some sort of voice or platform, it's often taken for granted how far those ideas can travel. I mean, this is like the whole history of economics and politics, those ideas lying around that finally get their day. And one of those ideas that I wanted to speak to you about was the idea of degrowth, which I like to talk to everyone about on this show, because that's always interesting to see what people's perspectives are. Because it's an idea that very much has its day, and it's an idea that has very big implications about how people think about the economy, how people think about things like GDP, how people think about things like human flourishing. And whether it's a good idea or a bad idea is yet to be told. But I think it's an important idea, and perhaps quite an insidious idea in terms of the subtext, the things that it says without kind of saying. And I'd love to hear your perspective on that, as both a South African in particular, and as an economist on a more perhaps global perspective.
Yeah, Bronwyn, I'm going to disappoint you there. I think it's an absolute rubbish idea. The idea, and for the very basic reason is that I would love a degrowther to go into a township and tell people that they should reduce their incomes. Right? I just think it's an absolutely. I mean, the way I would express it in an extreme version is to think of it as a kind of a very colonial view of the world. Like we, the rich West, will now tell the rest of the world how and what you should do with your income and growth, right? I think to aim to tell, I mean, that's not what they would say they would do. They would say it's the rich world that should
do. But then who's going to buy our stuff that we make? Who's going to pay for our labor?
So I think it's it's an incredibly paternalistic view of how things should work, but more than that, it's just an erroneous view of how actually economies and human flourishing is what you called it, and I like that, because it's exactly this, gets back to this infant mortality story, right? It's if we really care about humanity, which I think this is what we should do, then of course the aim should be to improve living standards, and yes, economic growth is very closely correlated with that. It's not exclusively that, it's also access to all kinds of public services, and of course private sector can help there as well. But usually the way you get there is by making the cake bigger. That's the kind of classic metaphor. And unfortunately, if you degrowth, if you make the cake smaller, there's no way that you can lift all boats. There's no way that you can feed everyone, is to extend the metaphor even further, right? That's just not how in the long run things have changed. And I must say, within my profession, within economic history, there is no appetite for this. I mean, basically my sense is from my colleagues abroad that they mock the degrowth scholars. There was a great at some point one of the key degrowth scholars won a major grant, several million, I think, euros for research into degrowth, and of course the kind of response was, given what he's proposing, that everyone should live at the same standard of living as Costa Rica, this grant should be able to last him 250 years, right? Because if he really proposes that, then he should be able to live at that same level of grant, and so several million pounds should be able to
show us
keep him going. Yeah, show us exactly. So I don't think there's much appetite for that. And I must say, I mean, this is the one nice thing about South Africa. There's absolutely no appetite also locally, I think, for that, right? So I haven't come across any kind of group or foundation or group of stakeholders that feel that somehow we should degrow. I mean, that's the strange thing is we in Europe, certainly where this movement is, I think, particularly strong, there's a massive divide about what the future should be, right? The one group would say, degrowth is a terrible idea, we should grow, but obviously with certain conditions. Another one would say, no, we should actually, we should, decrease our incomes and earn less. Now, if you have those multiple competing groups, there's no way to arrive at a single policy or an alliance or any kind of that, because it's fundamentally different, right? Here we have the same aim, of course, with different policies that we think we should get there, right? So perhaps more kind of state involvement or less state involvement, but ultimately we have the same goal, which actually is a major and an important step to take, right? If you're in a society where you don't have the same goal, finding some form of an alliance is almost impossible. So again, that's partly my pessimism towards Europe. Is like increasingly, I think these societies will become incredibly fractured along multiple dimensions, and one of them will be, what is the future outlook that you have? Whether you believe in a future where we should still grow incomes or perhaps stabilize incomes, versus one where you actually believe income should decline. I just don't see how you find uniform economic policies amongst those kind of competing goals.
I suppose what interests me about the subject is how it's almost becoming a populist cause, although it feels like quite impossible for something like degrowth to become popular. And yet I suppose it always depends on how you frame it, right? Populism is going to shift very dramatically going into the future. But you did make an interesting point around South Africa and around how for most of us, we kind of want the same things. Maybe our politicians don't, but most of the people, no matter what party you're voting for, most of us kind of want the same stuff. We want less stunted babies. We want better literacy rates. We want higher levels of human capital. We want increased incomes. We want more people living in decent homes. We want a safer society. That's the one thing every South African that I've spoken to across all the different research that we do. People just want safety and security. And they want a nice place to raise their families, right? So we kind of want the same things, but we disagree quite a lot based on what policies or what means are going to get us there. In fact, that's generally what most politics is about. It's about arguing over preferred means, and sometimes everybody's means is wrong, and sometimes some people's means are more wrong than others. But I wanted to ask you perhaps a more general question in that regard, in that what is it that politicians and the electorate and people in general consistently refuse to learn from the lessons of history, right? What are the means that stick around despite plenty of centuries, in some cases, of evidence to the contrary? What are our favorite lessons we refuse to learn from the past?
Yeah, I think the easiest way to answer that is to think about what I wrote today, basically on our long walk, is to think about science. So I think the one thing, if you draw a GDP per capita, to go back to the famous indicator, GDP per capita graph of global GDP per capita over the last, let's say, 500 years, and you've got this classic hockey stick, right? The line is flat, and then basically it starts, by the 1800s, it starts taking off, and it has this kind of exponential curve. And the weird thing is, like, you would have a Great Recession in the 1930s. You have a First World War in the 1910s and the Spanish flu, and you have Second World War in the 1940s. And these are tiny blips on that graph, right? That's the fascinating thing. If you look at that graph, you almost cannot recognize the Second World War, which is this, really a global war that involves all nations, and it's massive destruction of capital and human capital, and it's just incredible, and yet it's a blip on that line. So how is that possible, right? And then it must be because there's fundamentally something that underpins all of this immense progress, and that is our knowledge of nature. Is the nice way of thinking about science, right? It's how we think about how we understand nature and how we use our knowledge to improve our productivity. So and of course this, famously, we stand on the shoulders of giants. This is cumulative. So once you've invented something, or you've arrived at a new conclusion, others can build on top of that. And so it's an incredibly powerful idea, actually, of science, and the idea of using science then to innovate and to make us, workers more productive, and to build and improve our living standards as consumers. So that idea is fundamental to progress. And so, firstly, of course, you have to believe in the idea of progress, but if you do that, then, that must be the one thing that underpins all of that. So I think if there's one thing that frustrates me often is that, we spend so much time thinking about these other kinds of, which is, some of them are not completely unimportant, but we dedicate so much space in newspapers and in meetings or committee meetings and in policy debates, when fundamentally the real thing is about investing in science and innovation and allowing entrepreneurs to commercialize those inventions, right? To sell it locally, but especially to sell it abroad. Those are, if you think of any policy in terms of those core fundamentals, then I think a lot of policy discussions go out the window. So it's basically thinking about through every lens, is this policy helping us to develop new science or create new science, or allowing existing science to be turned into new ideas, commercial ideas that we can sell and export? Then that becomes a very simple exercise almost. So that's really the frustrating thing, is this, that we don't. I mean, the problem is that there's no real constituency that fights for that, right? It's academics are terrible at fighting for anything, so it's, we're not going to fight for that. And yet, and even within academia, I think there are many that wouldn't even acknowledge the fact that this is the real reason that we've made so much progress. But ultimately, that is, engineering. There's a great new paper in economic history on how engineering has really contributed to this immense human flourishing. So it's about, and engineering is a term, it's a very practical discipline, turning ideas into kind of more productive humans. And so it's a very simple thing. When I say it, it sounds like obvious, but ultimately we forget this very frequently in certainly in government.
And a similar question, what historical evidence do you find most often misinterpreted to suit current political aims? Because I often find that happens, because as you said, as history becomes more kind of relative, we can take the same story and we end up with different takeaways from it. But what historical event or data has been sort of misinterpreted, or perhaps misinterpreted by various different sides in whatever debate you're looking at?
I mean, I think maybe this is more kind of a personal frustration, is just that the whole history, all of our history is lumped together often as either colonialism or apartheid. So things have happened over, the last 300 years, 400 years in South Africa. And then often when we, look at the current inequalities or whatever, people just say, well, it's because of our history. Well, sure, it's because of our history. Inevitably, when it's a truism, it must be because of our history. Of course, we wouldn't have been here if there was no history. But, what economic historians care about is like, what history and how, and what is the mechanism that allowed this to happen? And, what are the political structures that allowed this to happen? So, and of course, when you start unpacking that, even my students in the second year struggle to differentiate between what apartheid was, what came before apartheid. So let's call that segregation or unification of South Africa. The idea that South Africa was not a country before 1910 is a very difficult concept for them. The idea that slavery was abolished already in the 1830s, right? So that, many, I see campaigns on campus like modern day slavery. Of course, there are elements of modern day slavery, or we might think of as like labor expropriation, but it's not chattel slavery that we had in the 1830s and before, right? That was very, very different. So, the job of the economic historian is often made very difficult when people just lump all of the history together. And I would really want to urge people to think, if we think about land in South Africa, which is, of course, an important topic today, but it's always been an important topic. I would say it's always been almost more important. The most important asset has always been land. Today, it's less important. Actually, there are certainly other types of financial assets that is probably more valuable today than land. But it's always been. But there have been multiple land regimes, right? So to just say it's the past, it's always it's because of past policies that really doesn't help us understand what exactly it was, right? Whether it was things that happened during apartheid with the Groups Areas Act, or whether it was things that happened before the Land Act, or of course, as I would argue, it's actually most of the land redistribution happened before 1930, like long before that. So, but it's that frustration, I think, that I find with just not knowing South African history very well, and certainly not much of African history, and then secondly, kind of just lumping it all together into one pot, and hopefully arriving at a truism that history must matter.
Yeah, it's always tempting to try and turn history into a fairy story, right? A story with a beginning, a middle, and an end, a hero and a villain. And it's easy if we can pick that, right? And that makes sense. And we can choose those, who's the heroes, who's the villains in our current time and space. But when you go further back in history, you see that everyone's had a chance to play various different roles, and it's not quite as simple as we might want it to be. Much like economics too, like everything's connected, right? Choices here impact choices there, and it's not so easy to say what's right and what's wrong, using broad strokes. However, there is still space that we should and must hold as social scientists for finding those absolute truths among all the relativism, so that we can actually make better choices. And that actually means being aware and being open to being corrected by the data that we see around us, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I think the question always should be, can we find evidence for this? Is there evidence to support or dismiss your hypothesis, right? Thinking in terms of questions, I think, is incredibly important, not in terms of statements. It's something that I try and imprint on my students often, is like, your essay should be a question. It's not just a history of Zimbabwe, right? That's not a question. We want to know, if you have a research question, then you can try and search for evidence to either support that and hopefully refute that in some way. Because that's ultimately, if you have a question, it becomes falsifiable. And if it's falsifiable, it means that there's at least some thinking behind that, right? And we can perhaps, if we falsify it, we move forward. We think about a new hypothesis or a new theory. And so but it's a difficult mindset, because it makes you very vulnerable. It means that you can be wrong, and people don't like to be wrong. And so that it's an acquired mindset. It's not something that I think you're kind of born with. Even it's something that you have to work at, and you have to work at it continually, right? It's easy for me to arrive at a position. My evidence supports, say, some hypothesis I hold. And then I tell the story, and it's a nice story to tell, and people believe me, and they're like, "Oh, this is a really interesting paper." And of course, then others start testing that, and they say, "Well, what about this? What about this?" And then you shouldn't be religiously invested in that hypothesis, because potentially there are competing hypotheses that you need to think about, and other explanations for what you have found. So it is a very difficult thing to do. It means that you are vulnerable, and you have to be open to being wrong, which is not, I think, an obvious human trait.
Yes, and not dying politically or individually as an academic on hills tied to hypotheses, or to hills tied to your favorite policy proposals. I mean, we've seen all sorts of political parties die in that regard. And we've seen many countries suffer from the refusal to learn from testing and failing of various different assumptions that we put out there, that we tend to just repeat the same mistakes over and over again. But Johan, you've been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining us on the Small Print. And where can people get hold of you if they want to continue the conversation, subscribe, maybe even pay you for your writing and research, or anywhere else that you'd like to be found / self-promote? This is your opportunity.
Thanks, Bronwyn. I forget to do this, so thanks for giving me the opportunity to do so. So I think the most obvious is to go to www.ourlongwalk.com. That's where people can sign up for free to my writing. There's also a subscribe option, a paid subscription option, where you get some insight into kind of the interviews that I do, and some of my research. And there I also publish some of my chapters for a revised version of my book that will come out hopefully in September or October, of Our Long Walk to Economic Freedom. That's a global history of basically our road to human flourishing, as you've nicely put it, but written from a South African perspective. So the idea is that we really kind of get a sense of what were these historical lessons that we've learned, how has economics or the past shaped the way we think about economics, and also how basically some of the things that we think about as being say, political or cultural reasons ultimately had economic underpinnings. So I think that's I enjoyed it. There's if people had bought the previous 2021 version, there's a couple of new chapters in there. So they've all got clickbait titles. So it's an easy read. So that will be out in September. But ourlongwalk.com is probably the best place to find it.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Bronwyn.
That's right, I'm wearing red. I did that very deliberately to try and capture your attention instead of my usual black. I did that because I've got quite important and very exciting, for me at least, announcement. And that is that our new book, Rescuing Our Republic, which has been written in conjunction with my friends and colleagues at Discourse ZA, is now out and about in bookstores across South Africa and available online for anyone else that is curious about South Africa. And as I've said before, as a futurist and a trained analyst and economist, I do think that South Africa is one of the clearest bellwethers as to where the weird Western world is headed. And as such, there's something you can learn from us at the bottom of Africa. We're ahead of quite a few of the trends that you're just wrapping your heads around. Anyway, this book is based on some of our most popular and most revealing, interesting and important conversations that we've had over the last couple of years at Discourse ZA, which is a YouTube channel you should absolutely subscribe to. It's also available as a podcast if you're interested in anything to do with politics, philosophy and economics. But the conversations in this particular book are focused on, as the title says, rescuing our republic, or more specifically, what civil society and individuals should be thinking about and doing and starting if they are interested in investing in a future for South Africa that we actually want to be a part of. Anyway, I would love for you to read this book and to give it to someone either that you like or that you hate, because the purpose of this book is to kickstart conversations around big, interesting, ugly even, but important ideas that are worthy of debate. So if you're planning on being bored or understimulated at a family or friend event this festive season, this is the book you need to give you the conversation starters to start a debate or a fight with those who you love or love to hate most.